Thanks everybody for coming tonight, especially in the bad weather, which means I guess I have to be extra interesting. Confucius. To learn the genius of Confucius, you should all have been at my wedding. I'm sorry you all weren't invited. You know how it is. You have to have all your mom's friends. You've got second cousins you see every 7 years, but anyway. The wedding was mostly a standard Judeo-Christian affair, the white dress, the breaking of the glass. But my wife is also Korean American, and she wanted to include a traditional ceremony called a pebek. For the ceremony, she would change into a Korean gown called a hanbok, and then we'd bow before her parents, who would in return offer their blessing, and toss walnuts and dates into her skirt as an encouragement of fertility. Bowing is a regular feature of life in East Asia. People bow not just to parents, but to elders of all types, and anyone in a position of authority. A friend who lived in Tokyo for many years says that you've been in Japan too long when you start bowing to people while talking to them on the phone. I, however, am not comfortable with bowing. Jews like me are taught to have too much respect for themselves to bow down before anybody. We all listen every year to the book of Esther, read out each Purim holiday, which tells of how one stubborn Jewish guy refused to bow down before a state official and nearly got the entire Jewish community of Persia wiped out. Even God, in modern practice, most often merits a mere bending of the knee and lowering of the head as a sign of reverence for the Almighty. But the bow I was going to have to do in front of my future in-laws was a true full-on forehead to the floorboards kowtow. My wife was taking the ceremony very seriously. She is far from the traditional Korean girl. She was raised in the Midwest and is as American as any other kid born in Indiana. But when it comes to her parents, a different person emerges. In traditional Korean culture, honoring your parents is the most important of virtues. People were judged based on how respectful they were to their parents. This tradition is pure, unadulterated Confucius. To Confucius, filial piety was critical to strong, stable families and therefore a strong, stable society. Everybody from the emperor down to the lowliest farmer was supposed to honor and obey their parents for their entire lives and even beyond. Confucius believed a truly filial son would not deviate from his father's ways 3 years after he died. My wife has absorbed these Confucian values with her own family, and I knew how important they were to her. Yet, I was so uncomfortable with the pebek that I decided to take a chance and express my concerns to my wife anyway. I'm sure you all can predict her response, which went something like, "Get over it. You're bowing to my parents, and that's that." So the morning of the wedding, I grabbed my wife's younger brother, James. We found a quiet corner in the hotel where we were staying, and I asked him to give me bowing lessons. You just can't bow any way you want. It has to be a proper stylized bow, your hands to the forehead. No, I'm not going to bow in front of all of you. I know that's what everybody was waiting for. I'm not, but you lower yourself down to your knees and put your forehead down to the floor for a few seconds. You sit up, again without touching the floor, and you wait for your future in-laws to give you their blessing. A few hours later, I found myself in front of my in-laws doing exactly that, my forehead pressed to the floor, with my own friends and family watching on. What I learned is that you just can't beat Confucius. Here we find the true genius of Confucius, an idea that he expressed 2,500 years ago in a town you've never heard of before in eastern China, possess the endurance and power to wield a direct impact on my life today. And not just my life, nearly a quarter of humanity is still highly influenced by Confucius' teachings today. That ranks him with Jesus, Muhammad, the Buddha, Aristotle, and Plato as one of the founders of civilization. However, here in the U.S., we know very little about Confucius. Whenever I mentioned I was writing a book on Confucius, inevitably someone brings up Charlie Chan or suggests a book title, something like Confucius Say. But this lack of understanding is actually quite dangerous. China and East Asia are rising on the world stage, and Confucius is rising with them. China today is presenting the U.S. with not just a political and economic challenge, but an ideological challenge. Beijing is presenting to the world a political and economic system that it sees as an alternative to American-style democratic capitalism, a system that its leaders believe is rooted in Chinese history and based on Chinese values. Every society is, at its heart, based on ideas. Ours is rooted in the ideas of the Greek philosophers, the Judeo-Christian texts, and, in more modern times, some writers from the Enlightenment. In China and much of the rest of East Asia, society is based to a great degree on Confucian ideas and Confucian text. It was Confucius who defined how governments should relate to their citizens and how husbands should relate to their wives. We have the Ten Commandments to tell us what is right and wrong. Confucius' code of gentlemanly behavior defined moral standards in China. Of course, in this age of globalization, Confucius' ideas don't dominate as much as they used to. Asians have been bombarded by foreign influences from all over the world. People in Shanghai and Seoul enjoy their Starbucks mocha lattes as much as any of us. Kids there listen to Taylor Swift and read Harry Potter. But Confucius is still there, under the superficial layer of Big Mac wrappers and NBA jerseys. It's no different than here. We are also influenced by ideas and culture coming from Asia. Our kids go to karate classes and we eat sushi, but that doesn't replace our underlying beliefs and ideas. The same is true in Asia. Confucius' influence can be found in most aspects of life: how governments govern, how CEOs manage their companies, how children get educated, and, as I found out at my wedding, how family members interact with each other. Confucius, a historical figure, if he came back to life today, would probably be shocked at the influence that he has had on history. The man himself spoke often about how he didn't consider himself really anything that special. In unstinted effort, I can compare with others, he once said, but in being a practicing gentleman, I have had, as yet, no success. Many of his contemporaries would have readily agreed. Since the story of his life left very few clues of his future greatness. Born in the 6th century BC, he was raised by a single mother in a family of minor officials. There is even some speculation among historians today that he was an illegitimate child. But Confucius possessed a love of learning and educated himself in history and literature, the texts that contain the wisdom of an even earlier age in Chinese history. From that, he crafted his own doctrine based on benevolence and justice, and set about trying to convince the ruling elite of his day that he held the solutions to the social problems facing China. At the time Confucius lived, China was torn apart in incessant conflict among scores of petty dukes and kings. His message of peace was that only virtue could ensure good government and restore order to society. In that mission, he failed. Though he briefly held a senior ministerial post in his home state, His ideas were generally rejected by the powerful men of his day. At one point, late in his life, he spent 13 years wandering around central China, looking for a virtuous prince to listen to his teachings, but to no avail. Where he did excel, though, was as a teacher. And that may be the best way of thinking about Confucius and his influence. I think most of us have had a teacher at one point in our lives who inspired us. I just had breakfast at a diner in New Jersey with my history teacher from my junior year of high school. He is responsible for my love of history, and he's the reason why I look into subjects like Confucius. Confucius attracted a group of students, which we call his disciples, who became convinced that his doctrine was the answer to China's problems, and they remained devoted to him for their entire lives. We don't know how many students he had. One ancient historian, writing around 100 BC, who had a penchant for exaggeration, said he had 3,000 students. But one of Confucius' early followers, Mencius, who is an influential Confucian philosopher in his own right, said he only had 70. But the core group of disciples carried on Confucius' mission after his death, attracting disciples of their own and spreading his message. The record of his teachings is enshrined in the most famous of Confucian texts, the Analects, which is really no more than bits of conversation that Confucius had with his disciples in the course of teaching them. Here in the Analects you can find the genius of Confucius. That genius is the way he expressed complex ideas of morality, government, and society with the simplicity that gave them their timeless, universal quality. I'll read you a couple of my favorite examples. Not to mend one's ways when one has erred is to err indeed. In another case, Confucius said, the rule of virtue can be compared to the pole star, which commands the homage of the multitude of stars without leaving its place. On another occasion, a disciple asked him, is there one word which may serve as a rule of practice for all one's life? Confucius answered, is not reciprocity such a word? Confucius then went on to preach a form of the Golden Rule 5 centuries before Jesus. What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. The Analects also portrays Confucius as a very human figure. The conversations reverberate with all the tones of real life, sarcasm, irritation, humor, regret, and dismay. When one disciple, for example, asked Confucius about death, Confucius said, you do not understand even life. How can you understand death? On another occasion, a disciple named Yu complained that the 3 years of mourning Confucius mandated for a deceased parent was much too long. Confucius waited for the student to leave the room, and then he turned to the others and said, was Yu not given 3 years' love by his parents? 2,500 years after Confucius had these exchanges, people in Asia are still listening. People like Vincent Lo. Vincent is a Hong Kong tycoon who has amassed a multi-billion-dollar fortune from real estate development. But whatever deal he's closing or a shopping mall he's opening, he tries to get home to Hong Kong every Sunday for dinner with his elderly mother. Imagine a billionaire American CEO making that same kind of effort. Vincent kindly invited me one night to one of his Sunday dinners with his mother in her house near Victoria's Peak in Hong Kong. He is one of 9 children, and most of them were there for dinner with their spouses, children, and even grandchildren. All the kids have been educated in the U.S. or Australia, all speak English fluently, all run businesses of their own, but they all still honor their mother at dinner on Sundays. The family is very important, Vincent explained to me. My father was very dutiful to my grandfather and grandmother. He always preached to us that we had to respect our elders. This is the ideal of the Confucian family, still very much alive in the 21st century. You can find a similar spirit, in a very different context, at the Unilock factory in Incheon, South Korea. There, Yu Myung-ho, the founder of Unilock, calls himself not just his manager, but the head of the family. In many companies in East Asia, Confucian family values have infiltrated corporate management practices, and that makes them operate very differently than firms here in the United States. After the 2008 financial crisis, when the world was tumbling into the Great Recession, American CEOs were laying off workers by the millions. But not Mr. Yu in Incheon. Though his sales were tanking, he refused to release a single one of his 200 employees. Instead, he transferred some from the assembly lines to product development groups or sent them for special training. He chose to go into debt rather than reduce the staff. You have to make them feel that the company is like your own, he told me about his employees. You have to make them feel like family. Mr. Yu believes that these Confucian-influenced management practices make his company stronger. As Confucius himself would have predicted, by treating his employees like family, they reciprocate in kind. They remain loyal and hardworking, saving Mr. Yu the cost of constantly recruiting and training new workers. Confucius, in fact, is credited with much more than that. The rise of China, Japan, and South Korea in the global economy over the past half-century is arguably the most important geopolitical shift in the world today. And some economists and analysts believe Confucius is behind that rise. Confucian values like hard work, thrift, and devotion to family, these analysts argue, has given East Asia an edge in entrepreneurship and economic development over other parts of the emerging world. Perhaps the single most important advantage Confucius bequeathed to modern Asia is its fanaticism with education. All those tiger moms out there forcing their children to practice piano for 3 hours a day and drilling them in calculus are a legacy of Confucius. So are those headlines you see in the newspapers today about students in Shanghai outscoring American kids on standardized tests. To Confucius, education was a route to self-cultivation and self-perfection. Even if you possess good qualities like courage or benevolence, you could still go astray without learning to guide you. This is how one of Confucius's disciples explained it in the Analects. The artisan in any of the 100 crafts masters his trade by staying in his workshop. The gentleman perfects his way through learning. Confucius himself set the standard for learning, though he often expressed self-doubt and made self-deprecating comments with the frequency of Woody Allen. He was proud of his devotion to study, a practice he maintained to the end of his life. Meditating on unanswerable questions or sitting under a Bodhi tree like Buddha, seeking enlightenment, was not for him. I once spent all day thinking without taking food, and all night thinking without going to bed, he said. But I found that I gained nothing from it. It would have been better for me to have spent the time in learning. I got firsthand experience with this obsession with education during my very first days living in Asia. I moved to Seoul, South Korea in 1996 when I was a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and rented an apartment in part of an old house on a narrow alleyway running down the side of a mountain in the middle of the city. One night around 11 p.m., I heard muted voices of teenagers on the street outside, and I looked out my window to see what was going on. It was high school girls carrying heavy stacks of books on their way home from studying. There was something very honorable about these kids. They had probably spent 16 hours studying for the grueling exams they need to pass to get into a good college. No video games or after-school cartoons for these kids. Childhood in Asia is all about studying, and studying some more. That's been true for a very long time. The exam system these kids were preparing for today is a modern version of the Confucian education that existed under the old dynasties for centuries. Back then, anyone who wanted a good government job had to master Confucian texts and not just study them, but actually memorize them. One modern scholar calculated that a student had to memorize 431,286 Chinese characters to prepare for the exams. The positive side of the system was that it offered a form of social mobility that did not exist in the West until much more modern times. The old exams were open to any boy who wanted to take them, whether he was rich or poor, from a noble family or a peasant household. This, too, was a legacy of Confucius. Merit was supposed to prevail over birthright. He believed people should be judged by their virtue and knowledge, not on their social status. But even as educators and envious parents in the U.S. look with wonder on the test-taking mastery of Asian kids today, in East Asia, the current system of education is much more controversial. Confucius' teachings, some believe, have been taken too far. Kids are robbed of their childhood and subjected to tremendous stress and pressure. Some families in South Korea have decided to flee the system altogether. Moms take their kids to the U.S. to enroll them in U.S. schools. The dads stay behind and work to pay the bills. These fathers have been nicknamed wild geese dads since they migrate back and forth between Asia and the U.S. One wild goose, Oh Dong-jin, who's a film critic in Korea, had lived apart from his daughter for a decade when I met him for coffee in Seoul. The system makes people ordinary, he told me, and takes away what makes them special. In Asia today, there are many other ways in which Confucius' enduring influence is unwelcome. Just mention his name to Judy Pei in Seoul, South Korea. Judy is a career-minded woman who wants to rise to the top of the corporate world in East Asia, and she blames the great sage for standing in her way. Over lunch in Seoul, she told me about how she faced discrimination in the workplace because she was a woman. When she first joined a Korean electronics company in the mid-1990s, only 100 women were hired on par with men out of 30,000 employees. The rest of the female workers were relegated to clerical chores or fetching tea. Her male colleague, she says, spoke to her as if she was a little girl, unable to understand her responsibilities. Though she managed to get promoted, eventually she reached a level of management that was so male-dominated, she believed she had no chance to succeed any further. She departed for a consulting firm, Accenture, hoping that an American company would offer her more opportunities. This continued discrimination against women in East Asia is becoming a major economic problem. Countries like Japan and South Korea are wasting a tremendous portion of their educated and skilled workers due to these old-fashioned prejudices. And that holds back economic progress and damages their international competitiveness. An International Monetary Fund study conducted in 2012 figured that only 9% of management positions in Japan and South Korea are held by women, compared with 43% in the US. Judy Pay's solution to this problem is simple: get rid of Confucius. Confucianism has played a big role in blocking women from going out and succeeding in their career lives, Judy told me. I think we should abandon that old concept. Judy is far from the only woman in East Asia who thinks that the region would be better off without Confucius. Women from all walks of life has attacked his ideas for condemning them to subordinate status in society. Going back to the old text, Confucius actually did not say a whole lot about women. But what he did say has gotten him into a lot of hot water. Women are the subject of one of his most famous, or actually infamous, sayings from the Analects. Women and servants are most difficult to nurture, he said. If one is close to them, they lose their reserve, while if one is distant, they feel resentful. Later Confucians built on sentiments like these to assign very different roles for men and women in society. The outer realm of politics, commerce, and civic life was reserved for men. The inner world of the household was controlled by women. That meant the primary duty of women was to manage the household and raise children. Within the home, women held tremendous authority. One famous 20th century writer and reformer, Hu Shi, once remarked that no other country in the world can compare with China for the distinction of being the nation of henpecked husbands. But Confucian thought did leave women in a subordinate position to men, as little more than household assistants. Women were bought and sold as concubines and often abused by overbearing husbands and in-laws. That's why one feminist writer simply called Confucius an eater of women. Not just modern women today have trouble with Confucius. At the dawn of the 20th century, Confucius' doctrine had become so dominant in government, households, and schools that he got blamed for just about every evil in Asian society. Compared to new ideas about democracy and equality drifting in from the West, Confucius seemed archaic, oppressive, and downright anti-modern. Democracy advocates accused Confucius of supporting dictatorships and suppressing human rights. In order to advocate Mr. Democracy, we are obliged to oppose Confucianism, one reformer wrote. The Communist Party in China once believed that Confucius was preventing the country from entering a Marxist golden age and tried to purge him from Chinese society, in some cases violently. During the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, the radical Red Guards ransacked China's most important Confucian temple, taking the statue of the sage from the main shrine and dumping it in a bonfire. In order for East Asia to be modern, it had to abandon its outdated Confucian traditions and become more like the West. Today, though, that period of rabid anti-Confucianism is being seen as something of a cultural aberration. Kishore Mahbubani, one of East Asia's most influential academics, describes this period of Western dominance as pouring concrete slabs over Asia's history. Now, he says, the economic success East Asia has enjoyed is building something he calls cultural confidence. What Asia is doing, he says, is finally drilling through those slabs and reconnecting back with its past. He calls this trend the most significant thing happening in Asia today. I discovered what he was talking about at a tea shop in downtown Beijing. There, every month, the members of the Bamboo for Living Culture Club meet to discuss the Chinese classics and, in many cases, Confucius and Confucian literature. They are from all walks of life. One worked at a finance company, another at a business association, and another was a hotel manager. What brought them together was a common interest in rediscovering China's ancient traditions and to put the wisdom of antiquity to work in their lives today. The American dream has influenced Chinese people to admire success, but the Chinese didn't learn the substance of the dream, one club member, Lei Bin, explained to me. They only learned to get things for yourself. China, he said, has lost itself. A return to Confucius, they believe, is the answer. Or, as another club member, Zhang Wanlong, put it, Confucius can guide China into the future. What role Confucius will play in that future is anything but certain, however. The Chinese Communist Party has had its own reawakening to Confucius, but for very different reasons than the members of the Bamboo for Living Culture Club. The government's interest is not spiritual guidance, but political legitimacy. The Communist Party that once vilified the great sage now is hoping he can build public support for its authoritarian ways. President Xi Jinping quotes Confucius so often, he can sound more like a Ming Dynasty Mandarin than the modern Marxist he claims to be. By reintroducing Confucius into government, Beijing is trying to make the case that its system has deep roots in Chinese history and culture, that China has been governed by Confucian autocracies since time immemorial, and that democratic ideas from the West have no place in Chinese government and society. The Communist Party is portrayed as a defender of Chinese values and tradition. Clearly, Xi Jinping and his communist cadres see China's political future in its philosophical past. In making this case, the government is using a version of Confucius that was crafted by the old emperors to suit their needs, a Confucius who supposedly preached obedience to authority and societal harmony. Beijing's leaders are turning to Confucius to convince the masses they are benevolent rulers, not the tyrants they actually are. The big question facing China, then, is what role Confucius will play in its future. Will it be Xi Jinping's Confucius, found in state propaganda, or the Confucius of the Analects, who ultimately wins the day? In the Analects, we find that Xi Jinping's Confucius is a distortion of his teachings. Confucius was not an advocate of autocracy. In fact, just the opposite is true. He believed good government was based on virtue. If a ruler governs with benevolence, cares about the well-being of the common man, and is upright in his own behavior, then people will be loyal to him without the need for coercion. Confucius even made the case that a government would have no need for laws or punishments if virtue prevailed. Confucius would look at the Chinese government today with its riot police, kangaroo courts, and execution grounds, and say that such brutality shows that they lack the moral right to rule. Here again we can find the genius of Confucius, 2,500 years after he lived, after so much political, economic, and social change. The great sage is playing as important a role in our future as he has in our past. That's because ultimately, Confucius's ideas belong to no age, no culture, and no country. I spent a lot of time thinking about how to define the heart of Confucius's message. This is how I would explain it. The message is that you should do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. That society can be perfected if we only strive to perfect ourselves. And that one person trying to do good can change the world for the better. Thank you very much for listening.
We have a few questions from the audience, so I'd like to read them to you aloud.
Okay.
So that they're picked up by the tape tonight.
Okay.
What was Confucius' lifestyle like? Did he live simply or extravagantly? Did he have a wife and children?
That's interesting. There's actually an entire chapter in the Analects. I believe it's book 10, but I did not memorize the Analects like all those poor Chinese kids had to do for centuries. But I think it's book 10, and which is basically a description of Confucius's life and his habits, how he ate, what he wore, how he would behave in different circumstances, what he would do when he was at, let's say, the Duke's court, how he would behave when he was before a person who he thought was very important. He believed in he had a few core beliefs about the way people should act. He felt that you should always follow the rules of propriety in all circumstances, no matter who you were talking to, no matter how simple the person might be, no matter how important that person might be. It didn't matter. That basically people are people, and you should treat them all the same with the same kind of respect. He also lived a relatively simple life. He did not pursue wealth, and he actually had mixed feelings about wealth. He wasn't an ascetic like you would see, let's say, in Indian tradition. He didn't think people should kind of starve themselves to seek enlightenment. At the same time, he felt that if you pursued wealth too avidly, that you would lose your way morally. That there's a saying in the Analects, something like, the gentleman knows what is moral, and the small man knows what is profitable, or something like that. So he himself never really pursued wealth, and he lived quite a simple life. In terms of his family, it's actually quite interesting because he himself took family so seriously and saw family as the basis of what the Confucians call a well-regulated family, as the basis of a well-regulated society. Society was built from the ground up, based on strong families, not from the top down from government. But we know almost nothing about his own family. He doesn't mention his parents at all in the Analects, and there's only a very vague references to his son in the historical sources. What we think is true is that he was actually married and divorced, and we know he had one son who died quite young, and we know that he had at least one daughter who he mentions in the Analects. He mentions her because he married her to a person who had spent time in prison because he thought the person had done nothing wrong, and he shouldn't be stigmatized for it. But there's also some record of him having a second daughter. But we don't know very much about his family, and the records that are left are all about interactions between him and his students who traveled with him and lived with him and were almost more of a family than his actual kind of blood family.
Okay, could anyone become a gentleman in the world of Confucius? What are the qualifications?
Well, since we only have another half an hour, that's actually that's more or less what the entire Analects tries to teach people, how to be a gentleman. Confucianism is to a great degree about human interaction, how you're supposed to treat other people in all circumstances and why, and what makes you a gentleman. There are some key virtues that you were always supposed to follow. The number one that Confucius talks about the most is benevolence, which at one point in the Analects he just describes as love your fellow men. He also expected people to be upright in their behavior. In other words, not to be corrupt, not to be dishonest, to hold to their word and hold to what they said. He also expected people to be courageous. not to be afraid of negative consequences of your actions, but to do what you think is right, no matter what. And as I mentioned in my talk, education was a factor in all of this. He felt that even if you had inherently good qualities, that you would somehow manage to lose your way unless you had the proper learning to guide you in your life. Being a gentleman was something that was never a complete process, something that you were doing for your whole life. And Confucius himself actually never thought he actually really became a proper gentleman. That basically you always make mistakes, and there's always more to do. There's always more to learn. There's always new ways to become better than you were before. And one thing that I found nice, what I found especially meaningful in Confucius' teachings, is the idea that you always look, because of that process, you always look to yourself. When things go wrong, when things go badly, when you have an argument with your wife, or you have a problem at work, or whatever the case, that you're not supposed to blame other people and rage against the injustice of the world, no matter how fun that might be. But you're supposed to actually look at yourself and figure out, okay, well, what did I do wrong, and how did I contribute to the situation? To look to yourself first and try to correct your own, where you may have gone wrong, as a first step to solving these types of problems.
What was it like to have dinner with Kim Jong-il, and what was he like?
Kim Jong-il. Oh, okay, we're changing. So someone was looking up a bio of mine.
Someone looked at your bio.
Yeah. Yeah, I was in North Korea as a journalist in 2000 when Madeleine Albright went. She was Secretary of State at the time, and she went for meetings with the North Korean leadership. And I actually got into the same room as Kim Jong-il, which I never expected to be. We didn't actually join him for dinner. We kind of were allowed to attend the dinner for a brief time and then thrown out when the actual serious work got started. And unfortunately, we didn't actually see him speak, but he was, as you see him in the pictures, with the teased up hair and the sunglasses indoors and the kind of pajama meets Mao kind of look, and the platform shoes, because he's actually quite short, so he wears platform shoes that elevate himself. Yeah, it's one of the highlights of my reporting life, getting about 8 feet from Kim Jong-il.
In the 19th century and early 20th century, modernizers in China and Korea criticized Confucius's influence on their societies, blaming Confucius for the lag in economic development. How legitimate were these critiques in retrospect?
This is interesting. There's been all kinds of flip-flops of opinion on this. When in the 19th century, when it started to become clear to people in China and Korea and Japan that their economies had fallen far behind the people who they used to consider barbarians in the West in terms of technology and economic management, they started to reassess their societies and to figure out what had gone wrong. And what's interesting is that the first stage of this process was actually a battle between Confucians over what was the best way to make China more Confucian. Their initial analysis of this was not that our Confucian traditions had created our problems, but that since we had strayed from Confucian traditions too much, that was a source of our problems. So the debate was over how do we strengthen what our historical traditions and values were. Then when you got into the 20th century and people became more and more influenced by Western ideas about capitalism and democracy, this attitude started to shift. And Confucius and Confucianism was seen as being the reason why the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe and not in China. That Confucianism stifled the individual entrepreneurship that was necessary to capitalism, that it confined people to strict codes of behavior and and that was a constraint on open democracy. So you had a whole group of reformers, many of whom actually went on to found the Communist Party, who believed that if China was going to modernize, if China was going to start to compete again with the West, that it actually had to purge itself of Confucian ideas and had to adopt more Western ideas. Then this all kind of flip-flopped again, starting around the 1970s, when Asian economies started to grow so quickly and rise in influence in the world. That started with Japan in the 1960s and 1970s, and then South Korea and Taiwan, and then eventually China. And when economists and analysts were looking at these countries, and they're like, okay, well, what do all these places have in common? And they focused again on Confucius. Well, they all have these Confucian traditions, and that's what's driving their success when a lot of the rest of the emerging world was still kind of stuck in poverty. So then Confucian ideas like hard work, thrift, the family networks that connected businesses together, the way that governments were able to introduce reforms and policies. All these different things were considered to be Confucian, and then were seen as the secret of Asia's success. So you've had all these flip-flops of opinion on this over the years as to how Confucius has actually played into Asia's economic success and economic failings. And I kind of struggled, well, what do you learn from all of this? I think what you learn from it is that it's hard to take cultural traditions that have been around a really long time and use them to understand what's happening in front of you at the moment. What people were doing was looking around them and trying to figure out why things appeared how they appeared, and they latched onto to ideas that had been around a long time. And then when the circumstances changed, they looked at the same ideas and reinterpreted them differently. So how you feel Confucius actually affected Asian economies over the last 150 years really depends on how you want to interpret how culture impacts economic change.
How does the growth of Christianity in Asia gel with Confucianism?
Growth of Christianity in Asia. It's interesting. A lot of people in Asia, when you mention Confucius and Confucianism, would not call themselves religiously Confucian, though I have met people who do. They tend to think of Confucianism as a life practice or a way of life or a social philosophy. So this allows them to basically be Christian or be Buddhist and also be, to a certain extent, Confucian. Other people in Asia would call themselves actually religiously Confucian, and they see Confucianism as a religion in the same way that you would consider yourself being Christian or Jewish. I think what you see happening, not just with the spread of Christianity in Asia, but the spread of global culture generally, whether it's what people are seeing in movies and TV shows from the West, ideas about politics, ideas about gender parity, all of this that's kind of mixing up. What's happening in Asia is that, just like everywhere, is that you're forming an almost kind of a globalized culture where these very ancient traditions are still there, and they're starting to mix with new ideas to produce something somewhat new, something almost like a truly global culture. Because as I mentioned, we here too are influenced by what's going on in Asia. That's what globalization is all about. And as China and other countries in East Asia become so much more influential in the world, we're going to be influenced more and more and more by them. I mean, just look at the influence like Korean pop music, and I'm amazed at how many teenagers know like Korean pop music. So these lines of cultural exchange are kind of moving in both directions and creating, I think, something entirely new.
And what would Confucius have said about the internet?
What Confucius said about the internet? I'm making this up. I'll preface it with that. But since Confucius was such a huge proponent of learning, I would assume that any tool and any technology that he could get hold of to increase his learning and his ability to study and his way of seeking out knowledge, he considered to be incredibly positive. Remember, back then you were dealing with, books that were written on bamboo slats and held together with wooden tongs. So I'm sure he'd find the digital world to be a much easier way of learning about the world.
Does anyone else want to answer or ask a question with the mic tonight?
If the women in Asia feel that Confucius has kind of suppressed or oppressed their ability to rise in the workforce and politically, how do you attribute the same problem that women in the States have, that we don't get equal pay and it's difficult to rise even here in certain companies and aspects of American life?
I guess, unfortunately, discrimination against women is not limited to Confucianism. However, when you look at the traditional Confucian family, how different is it from the traditional family, full stop? Families in India and actually, traditional families even in Europe weren't all that different, where you tend to have a dominant father figure and a mother who probably stayed at home raising kids, and kids who were supposed to be seen but not heard, right? You're in many ways, Confucian family values are not a whole lot different from family values generally. I think what makes, and I actually struggled with this when writing the book, because there's a chapter in the book on family, and I found myself writing it and I'm saying, wait a second, this sounds like my family. So what makes a Confucian family different? And I think there's two things. I think first is that the stress on filial piety in the family, in the Confucian family, is much stronger than it would be in the West, where the level of obedience that children are supposed to show toward their parents is I think much more extreme than you see in a lot of other cultures. And I think the other aspect of it that's different is that I think in many ways change has been much slower in the way the family has changed in Asia. I mean, it's pretty remarkable for me today, if any of you go to South Korea, about how incredibly hip and modern the place is. But when it comes to women, women are still expected to kind of leave their jobs when they get married. These traditions, I think, are kind of dying harder, and that shows in the statistics about women in the labor force, women in management, women on boards of directors, women in government. The current prime minister of Japan has a program he calls Womenomics, which is a rather lame, actually, attempt at convincing more women to join the workforce, which isn't having a lot of success. So I think what makes Asia different than a lot of things we see here is that I think these on issues of gender parity and other things, they're, I'd say, a little farther behind from where we are on these issues.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I hope you